In today's video, I'll be proposing that there were multiple Elohists in the composition of the Pentateuch, and that their identities have been obscured by later redactors. This adds a new twist to the documentary hypothesis. Traditionally, the documentary hypothesis proposed 4 different layers to the composition of the Pentateuch, abbreviated as J, E, D, and P. The E stood for the Elohist, which was, at least originally, strongly associated with the word Elohim, which is the Hebrew word for God. But for a biblical author to use Elohim instead of the name of the God is unusual, at least to me. If you're familiar with my channel, you know that I show that the Bible was written mostly as propaganda. And if it was written as propaganda, then why would a biblical author use a generic name for God instead of promoting the name of the God, such as Yahweh? This was due to a propaganda technique that I refer to as the generic juke. We see this technique used throughout the Bible. I first noticed it in the Davidic narrative, when, after reconstructing the original narrative that the biblical text was based on, I realized that David had been Jonathan's armor-bearer. However, since according to the biblical author, David wasn't Jonathan's armor-bearer, they couldn't use the name David in that part of the narrative, and it was replaced by an anonymous character referred to simply by the generic title armor-bearer. I again saw it in Genesis, when after reconstructing the original narrative, realized that Cain had been replaced in part of the story using the generic term for man, which is Adama, or Adam. And again in 1 Kings 20 and 22, the original name of the king of Israel in the narrative had been replaced by the generic title of the king. If you'd like to learn more about these instances of the generic juke, be sure to check out my videos on David and Jonathan, the Garden of Eden, and Jezebel. So if we apply this technique to the Elohist, the original Elohist text would have contained the name of a god instead of the generic term of Elohim. However, the Yahwist redacted the name and replaced it with the word Elohim. You might be asking, why wouldn't the Yahwist just replace it with the name of Yahweh? From a propaganda perspective, the Yahwist would have felt that replacing it with Yahweh would have been too blatant. People who had heard the original Elohist narrative would have known that Yahweh was not originally part of the narrative. However, if the generic term of Elohim is used, it allows for a plausible misunderstanding for the original reader. The Yahwist essentially says, oh, you thought that part of the story was about another god? No, it just says Elohim there. You must not have heard the other part of the story that talks about Yahweh. In this way, the Yahwist attempts to avoid tipping off the reader that the text is propaganda. This allows for the possibility that multiple names of gods were redacted, which in turn allows for the possibility of multiple Elohists. And that, of course, is what I think is the case. All of the white boxes here you see are the oral traditions that the text was based on. Starting at the bottom layer, Elohist 1 took 2 separate traditions, one about Joseph and one about Moses, and combined them into one text along with his own propaganda. Elohist 2 then builds on the narrative of Elohist 1 and redacts the name of the Elohist 1's God, while adding in the name of his own God, as well as integrating Jacob into the narrative. Yahwist 1 then redacts the name of Elohist 2's God and adds in the name of Yahweh. Yahwist 2 then takes the work of Yahwist 1 and adds in the narratives of Abraham, Ishmael, and Balaam. You notice here a gap between the narratives below Yahwist 2. That's because Abraham and Jacob were not originally related. Yahwist 2 had to find a way to bridge the gap. He does this by preventing Isaac from being sacrificed and adding that character into the narrative gap. During this part of the narrative, the use of Elohim as a name drops away. Finally, the priestly source was added. This was an independent source, but also had its own Elohist and Yahwistic layers. To clarify, it's not that the Yahwists couldn't use the word Elohim, but never as a direct name, and usually only in a few types of instances. One type was as a descriptor, for example, Yahweh, Elohim of Israel. Another type was when referencing items from an Elohist narrative. For example, a Yahwist couldn't say staff of Yahweh or mountain of Yahweh because those items were not originally associated with Yahweh. Instead, they are referred to as the staff of Elohim and the mountain of Elohim instead of using the name of the original God associated with those items. Another possible type is in dialogue. I'm still exploring this type, but it may be that a Yahwist didn't feel comfortable having characters who were not followers of Yahweh using the name of Yahweh, as the original reader may have known that was not the case. So a Yahwist can use the word Elohim, but an Elohist never uses the name Yahweh, as they would have used the name of whatever god they were promoting instead. With all that in mind, it raises a question. Who were the gods of the Elohists? Well, the Yahwists may have left the names of those gods in the text. But you might ask, why would a Yahwist mention the name of another god? Didn't I just get done explaining why they redacted those names? The answer to that is yes, but there are at least a few types of instances where the Yahwist might have retained the name of the original gods. First, a Yahwist may have retained the name of another god in order to equate that god with Yahweh. Second, a place name may have contained the name of another god, and the Yahwist wanted to associate that place with Yahweh. Third, a poem or a hymn may have been so well known that a Yahwist didn't feel comfortable replacing that name of another god, even with the generic Elohim. So, let's take a look at the text and see which gods are mentioned. In Genesis 16:13, Hagar says to Yahweh, "You are El Roi." However, this may have only been an attempt to associate the place name with Yahweh and wasn't necessarily the god of the Elohist. In Genesis 21:33, El Olam is mentioned, but again, this may only have been an attempt to associate Yahweh with the tamarisk tree and was not the god of the Elohist. El is mentioned in Genesis 33:20. This does seem to be part of an Elohist layer and could be the name of the god of that Elohist. In Numbers 12:13, Moses surprisingly calls out to El to heal Miriam. Although it's true that it looks like El later became a generic name for God, we can't be certain that is the case here. Besides, once again, from a propaganda perspective, a biblical author wouldn't have used a generic term for God unless they had to. In Numbers 23:22, it is El that brought the Israelites out of Egypt. El Shaddai is strongly associated with the priestly source, and I think the god of the Elohist in that source was El Shaddai. However, there is at least one instance of El Shaddai that is not part of the priestly source, and may have been the god of another Elohist. In Genesis 43:14, Dr. Joel Baden attributes the verse to the Yahwist, but he admits it is the only time the Yahwist uses the name. I don't think it is Yahwistic, but instead is from one of the other Elohists. Finally, in Numbers 23:22, it says that Ehyeh sent Moses. This also could be from an Elohist that the Yahwist leaves in order to associate it with Yahweh. In my next video, I'll go through the Joseph narrative in detail and show how it is primarily composed of Elohist 1 and Elohist 2, and show how Elohist 2 integrates Jacob and Reuben into the story. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and please like, share, and subscribe.